So good morning, Helen. Can we just check that sound is working your end, please?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. So I'm hoping and presume that everybody can hear me this morning. So I'm sat here in Fairford, Gloucestershire on a very wet morning. So first of all, may I do what Helen's done and just thank Bimeda UK and Ireland for sponsoring this role this morning. And as you know, Bimeda are very much involved in trace element mineral nutrition and have asked me to present on their behalf this morning this role of key trace elements in sheep health and fertility. So I believe you've got a chat option on Zoom, so you can type in questions on the chat option as we go, and we'll take questions at the end, Helen, if that's okay with you. Thank you. So as you can see,
can they come in the Q&A, Peter, as opposed to the chat?
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, come through the Q&A. That's great. No problem at all. So we'll get that sorted out as we go, Helen. Thank you. So we'll look at this role of key trace elements in sheep and health, and we'll go into where we are. So just a little bit about the background of myself. Up until 2013, I was actually the technical manager for Telsol Limited, which is now owned by Bimeda. But for various reasons, I decided to set up on my own, and very kindly, Bimeda still use me as a consultant and wheel me out in my wheelchair to get things sorted and discussed and try and assist where we can. So based in Gloucestershire, cover the whole of the United Kingdom, Ireland, Europe and other parts of the world as necessary, although that's slightly curtailed, and have had some 30 years experience within mineral nutrition, livestock management and nutrition in general. So that's enough about me. So in terms of an agenda this morning, what we were going to look at was some of the trace elements. Those are particularly aligned with the Bimeda product range. So that's being selenium, iodine, cobalt and zinc. But in total, we count some 22, 23 elements that are actually important to animal nutrition. And we will look at that very lightly as we go forward. I want to look at some advantages of slow release trace element boluses over other methods of supplementation, but obviously there are many ways to supplement and many good ways. And generally speaking, all things are quite good, but we just need to understand mode of action. We need to talk about good bolusing technique. Very difficult to do on a computer, and I've got no supporting video with me, but there are a few bits and pieces I'd like to go through with that. Talk about the Bimeda range a little bit, although this isn't really a sales type thing at all. And then we close with Q&A as Helen has just indicated. So we move on into the guts of the program and talk about these key trace elements that are required, if you like, for sheep. And when we talk sheep, I'm really talking obviously sheep and lambs together. If I define things differently, I'll try to do that as we go through the talk when I'm referring more to lambs and then perhaps adult sheep. But also here I'm talking about the adult sheep in terms of the female, talking about lambs in terms of male female, but also may refer to tups, particularly at times, because we still tend to forget the poor old boys and what they have to do, particularly at this time of year. So we're going to go across some of those areas. We may also just run lightly into some of the reasons why trace elements may not be appearing where you might think they may be in your crops, etc. And are there other influences that are happening to suggest why those things could be issues to you. So let's go on into the program, see what we can find out and take you through where we are at this stage. So some of you very kindly may have actually seen me speak before, and one of the things that I always try to start with, whether we're talking trace element mineral nutrition with animals, whether we're talking with humans, is actually understanding one or two basic points, if I may be so blunt, about where we might sit and hold our breath before we actually start thinking I've got a mineral problem. And in many instances, my experience tells me that sometimes when we roll up to discuss mineral imbalances, deficiencies, and sadly sometimes toxicities, we actually are in a position also where we can see other reasons why animals may not be performing to the level that perhaps is expected. And generally, I've got something like a checklist in my mind that applies to all classes of stock. It's very difficult to consider management of stock on just a one sort of trip into a livestock producing unit. But obviously the management, all the issues that go with them, what you're trying to do with them, what markets you're trying to get to, what weight, what breed, what grazing systems, what areas of types of grazing that you've got. Something came from a webinar yesterday that I've just answered for Helen this morning on the more wider grazing platforms, things like vetches, things like sandfoin, things like plantain. Are these going to work? What levels are we trying to do? So making sure that one key element of animal nutrition, which will always be my basis, is the importance of driving dry matter intake into those animals, whether they're grazing, whether they're housed, or whatever system you're feeding. That actually holds all of the nutrients, whether that be energy, whether it be protein, whether it be minerals, whether it be some of the vitamins that are in some of the grazing platform materials and grass, or any of the feeds that you're using. So making sure that we understand dry matter intake and how important it is to get that into the animal and accessible to them. So in grazing situations, a little bit harder to judge what they're doing, but using plate meters, trying to get some averaging going on. But when we're indoors, trying to get dry matter intake monitored and understood, and if animals stop eating, why do they stop eating, and looking at rations and making sure things are done. So in terms of the ration side of it, energy and protein obviously very much tied up in the dry matter intake. And here, when we speak to your good selves, quite often, I'll often ask the question, how many of you consciously always analyze your forages and your materials for energy and protein, so we know what we're dealing with? So that energy and protein is really, really important to get the basic rationing understood and done. And also then paying attention to all of the things that you're putting into the breeding flock, to the fattening lambs, or whatever system you've got, about understanding, the energy and protein levels that are going in, but also considering that most feeds, not all that you buy in, may have a mineral content in them. So at certain times of the year, we can see animals that, for argument's sake, may have been bolused, but now they come in to be housed, and they're actually on a proprietary bought-in feed, which in most cases will have a mineral content. But at this stage, we want to make sure that we're not overdoing the mineral content. So make sure that when you're purchasing feeds from suppliers, that they understand what you're doing, in terms that you may have bolused, you may have put a drench in, you may have had free access minerals, you may have had buckets out, but then you bring in a feed, but keeping buckets out. Is that the right or wrong thing to do? So earlier I mentioned toxicity, and what we see in sheep are sadly toxicities mainly with copper, but selenium can be an issue and is starting to worry some of us about how much we're feeding. So just make sure that we don't overdo it. There are overlaps that we continually do because we've always done it as farm practice, which may just mean a little bit of thinking about. And quite often we forget water. This is probably more applicable in some ways to larger stock, but water content is very, very important for an animal to function properly. So it needs to be clean, it needs to be accessible, but also sometimes water can bring issues with excess minerals. And one of the notable ones of that can actually be iron. Sulfur is one, and if you're getting sulfur in water, you will actually find a situation where you smell that area, and that will smell of rotten eggs basically. So have a think about some of the things that you may have done in standard farm practice, but you may be able to change and look and be a little bit more effective, and obviously it sometimes also make cost saving decisions, which actually also can sometimes improve situations. So we have, just to overview where we are, we have the general management, we have dry matter intake, obviously bringing in all the nutrients, but obviously we're particularly interested in trace elements. Then thinking about water, making sure that is right. But on many occasions, people will talk to me about soil. Now, let's just have a look at that soil. It is your bank. It is what is producing your crop. We need to understand soil in the sense of making good management decisions within our flock production, within our production of animals per se across farms. But one of the things I often get presented with is a soil report, whether it's a long one or a short one or an in-depth one, saying, I think I've got mineral problems, so I've analysed my soil. If you don't take anything else away from me today, soil is important, but the minerals that are in soil do not necessarily automatically follow into the crops that you are growing, thus transferring into your animals. So if you're looking to try to understand at any time what minerals are actually being consumed by a natural route, by an animal, then you want to analyze growing crops, or then you want to analyze the crop that has been ensilled for winter feeding or whatever system that you employ. So forage mineral analysis can be accessed, accessed through quite a lot of the suppliers. Some will charge you, some won't, but there's an investment around that you would have to look at, but it is not a terrible price. So if I just gave a very crude ballpark figure, which is in excess of what you would pay, you're looking at about £50 maximum for a forage mineral analysis. But alongside that, always please analyze for forage, for energy and protein at the same time. And as you can see on the screen, we have disease. Obviously, I'm not a vet, so that comes into terms of talking about making sure that we have flock health programs, that we are doing all our ecto and endo parasites correctly, and making sure that we've got everything right there. So what we're really talking about is a complete management MOT, an assessment, if you like, about what's going on. So where we have these situations, these things are in my mind before I'll even start talking to you about mineral and mineral nutrition. So let's move on to the next slide, and let's look at some of the minerals that we have in place. So as you look at the screen this morning, ladies and gentlemen, you have on the left-hand side of my screen, macro elements, major elements, the big elements, don't mind what you call them, but these are often the unsung heroes, the forgotten elements, because people just assume that they're there. And if there was ever a king in this world, it's calcium. So in terms of why we're quite interested in calcium and making sure that this works, just to pick on one, and I'm not going to dwell on this, this is the element that forms the animal frame. Without frame, you will never get good production, good formation, carcass, etc. So we always think about calcium. Difficult in a grazing situation because it's quite a difficult element to actually supplement when we're out grazing. But have a think about it, make sure that we're not missing a trick here. But here we want to highlight this morning some of the 20, I think it's probably 16 or 18 elements on there, but those that we're going to have a little detailed look on will be not necessarily in the order that I'm going to say them now, but we'll have a look at zinc. It's becoming quite fashionable for various reasons. We know quite a lot about zinc, and I'll come into detail about that in a moment. Cobalt, and we still, being very sort of general about this, but cobalt for our lambs particularly, we still see many situations where we're not really getting that cobalt right. So I'll try and cover that within the in-depth slides as we go on. Iodine, fashionable, yes, do not overfeed it, can cause you other issues at the same time. So think about those things. We have a connection here also with selenium, and our good friend copper will also come into this. So we're trying to look at these in a little bit more depth as we go through and as time allows, and hopefully you pick up one or two hints and tips as we go forward. So just checking that I'm not getting any messages for saying what goes on. So we should be fine. So I take it everybody's hearing me okay this end? Hello?
I am, Peter.
Yeah, lovely. Okay, just check. I'm just checking through that everything's okay.
We did have a raised hand from a David Mead, but if David could put a question in the Q&A, if he's got a comment, that would be great.
That's great. David is actually an employee of Bimeda.
Ah, right.
Okay, so just so we know. So in terms of where we are looking going forward, just hopefully everybody's hearing, it's disconcerting when you can't always see everybody here. So
Yeah.
in terms of where we are, health issues attributed to trace element imbalances. And this morning, I think I've only actually used the word deficiency probably once. So we're trying to sort of do a bit of word re-education here. So when we start to look at some of the issues that we can very clearly attribute to mineral imbalances, we sometimes look at issues around selenium and iodine. I'll come back to the detail of the trace elements, but stillborn lambs, weak lambs, sometimes even earlier abortions, retained placenta, metritis, so those animals that are not cleaning up and still smell a little bit at the back end. So those sort of things, we know that mineral imbalances actually can produce, but at the same time, we also know very clearly that there are other issues that can do this. So this comes back to my view of an assessment of how we do things. And then we talk sometimes about animals that are either breeding or adult or even young animals going through poor thrift, and sometimes fertility becomes an issue. And we see things like extended lambing or too many empty rates. Again, lots of other reasons that this can happen, but we know that copper itself, if it becomes imbalanced, can be an issue. But here, when we talk copper in sheep, we do need to be quite cautious, as you all know as good sheep breeders, that copper has a positive, but it also has a negative. So in no way this morning am I trying to entice you to use copper at all without knowing why we want to do it and have good reason and understand animal status. Within the technical side of the industry, we talk a lot about the impacts of iron, molybdenum and sulfur on copper. It's still a very hot discussion between those of us that are very interested in it, exactly what it does and how it works. So we know that where we see these elements, it can have some impact on copper, but also molybdenum and sulfur can bring something called a thiamolidate, which I don't want to dwell on too much this morning, but thiamolidate actually brings the animal into conflict with molybdenum and sulfur, and it acts in its own right as well as it does depress copper. And selenium also has quite a big role in terms of fertility and viability, but also immunity. So we think around those areas well. So then if we look at lack of thrive, particularly in lambs, and we then think about cobalt, vitamin B12, and the absolute importance of getting that right and actually getting it right perhaps more quickly than you think. So at an earlier age, we need to be thinking about that cobalt, because without cobalt, we will never get animals to actually convert as well as they should. So reduced immunity, horn structure, skin quality can be put at the door of zinc. But again, some of these elements like cobalt aren't storable, and zinc is not a storable element. So we need to think about how we can do that and best make that work. And all these types of things need some consideration, but they also need consideration knowing animal status. So here we obviously need to think about bloods to see our statuses, etc. So we think about bloods, we think about liver at times as well. So let's move on into another slide and look now at selenium as perhaps our first element that we'd like to talk about. So in terms of selenium, it is obviously one of the essential trace elements. It is actually within the Bimeda range as Cozy Cure sheep and Cozy Eye Cure. Cozy Eye Cure actually has less selenium in it, but don't worry about a numbers game. Selenium is more about getting the balance right. It's not about mine's better because it's got more in. This is something the industry wants to move away from very quickly, in my view. So in terms of the selenium functions, we know that selenium has functions in fertility, basically holding embryos, trying to make them very aggressive, if you like, so they stay and grow well. We know it has areas on growth rate, but in fact, one of the most interesting areas is probably to do with disease resistance and its role in trying to support a good immune system and protecting cell structure, etc. But one of the things that people still forget is that selenium is very much linked to iodine, and we'll talk about that later. So we have minerals which work together in the animal, and selenium and iodine in the trace element world is probably one of the best ones to actually make that link to. So when we actually think about looking at selenium, we really need to think about first and foremost iodine, if you like, in conjunction. And the other one also is vitamin E. And you'll see in a lot of the proprietary products that you use, vitamin E is actually already supplied. So where we see these deficiency imbalance systems, we sometimes see infertility. If we're really struggling with selenium imbalance or deficiency, we may actually see white muscle disease. We'll come back to that in a few seconds. A stiffness in the gaits, an ill thrift, sometimes retained placenta, and this impaired immune function. And we can actually see selenium-induced iodine deficiency. So here it's a matter of looking at the messages that are being given to us by some of the signs that we see in animals, certainly what you observe as flock masters, and also looking at the levels of trace elements being supplied from a grazing platform and or other products. But basically, just to give you some idea about what's happening with selenium imbalance, we see white muscle disease. And as you look at the screen this morning, you'll actually see on the left-hand side a piece of muscle which was taken from an animal actually suffering with white muscle disease. And what's really happened here is that the selenium has got to such an extent that it can't work. And basically the muscle and sinew has been broken down within the animal because the selenium is missing some of the links and functions it can do. So obviously when we look at this, we want to get this right, we can defend it, and it's about putting selenium into animals at the right time. So that may be at pre-tupping, so that the products last into the gestation period and into the early lambing period. So selenium critically important for the animal at various times around pre-tupping and particularly around lambing. And we know that selenium is particularly good at transferring across the placenta. So if the dam has adequate selenium, then a proportion of that will actually get through into the growing neonatal, and it also will pass in a while into milk. So there are things that you can do, but this becomes quite a specialist approach to do this. And it's not always about amounts of selenium that you need to put in. So moving on, we'll just have here a look at iodine. And I'm sure most of you have seen everything in the press, but iodine, we need to be a little bit more careful about what we're actually doing at producer farm level. So many people know and understand quite rightly that iodine itself is actually not a storable element in the animal as such. However, that when we go testing for iodine in things like thyroid glands, we will actually find quite a lot of various forms of iodine found. But we need to be feeding a small labile pool, so we don't need much iodine. If you overfeed iodine, then you can actually start to disrupt the ability of the dam to give the colostrum into the animal, and it starts to affect the young animal's ability to take the goodness from the colostrum that is there. So again, we need to think about iodine when we need to use it. Do we need to use it? What forms is it in, and what times are important? So just a little warning of iodine here, not to say that you shouldn't use it, but to say that we must make sure that we understand the process and the level that we're putting in the best way we can. So in terms of iodine functions, it is a major element for metabolic rate. So if you like, it's the 4-star petrol going into the young lamb, or if we just talk calf for a minute, the same thing. Then we need to get that iodine in at the right time to make sure that it's usable, layable and functional, but we mustn't overdo it. The other interesting thing here, that iodine in the young animal and the older animal also has an absorption job to do with vitamin B12. So again, we need to make sure that we don't overdo this, but we need to make sure we have enough iodine in place for this stream to work properly. So also we looked at carbohydrate absorption and helps food utilization. But the area that I'm more interested in is basically fetus development, brain, heart, lungs. So when that neonatal is grown, we need to make sure that everything is getting through properly, but again, not overdoing it. So iodine, critically important. But as we move on, what we need to think about here is how it actually is working in the body. And if you remember earlier, I spoke about the relationship that we have in terms of selenium and iodine. So they're codependent. So if you like, iodine is codependent on a good selenium. So message one is, if you think you've got iodine or selenium problems in the breeding flock, then talking with your veterinary practices, just have a little memory jogger to say, yeah, I need to actually be looking at selenium and iodine together here. Selenium blood testing is actually economically very good. Iodine blood testing is a little bit more expensive. So we need to make sure that we have that selenium dependent enzyme to make our iodine come active. So we can find inactive iodine in the body, but if we've got selenium deficiency, true selenium deficiency with it, the animal cannot transfer the iodine into a form that she can use. So we want to go from T4 to T3 to make sure that that can be used. This is quite old work. You can see I've referenced it in the bottom left-hand corner. It was done by Arthur and Co. up at the Rao Institute back in the 1980s. And unfortunately, I'm saddened to say that in the 80s was about the last time that we were doing good mineral science in this country. So we do see a lack of research investigation into minerals, I'm sad to say. So if I win the lottery, I'll help somebody. But anyway, let's move on into other things. So here already this morning, we've looked at selenium and we've looked at iodine and we've looked at the coming together of those two elements. Cobalt, in my view, is probably the element that I still have the most discussions about within the sheep industry in the United Kingdom, Ireland, in other parts of the world. So cobalt is one of the elements that is not storable effectively in the animal. So we do need to make sure that we can get that cobalt into them, but it has to be a form that is rumen available. So those cobalt deficiency signs that we normally see are animals that come to a bit of a stop, i.e. they're not putting on the daily live weight gain. So growth and impaired thrive are to a point the same thing. One of the other areas that is quite interesting linked to cobalt is actually fertility. So we may think more around cobalt and fertility at tupping time. And as the UK itself in general has a poor level of cobalt within grazing platforms, it's not true to say it's like that all year round because it's quite seasonal, but certainly at weaning time, cobalt will definitely be under pressure in a lot of pastures. That also depends on pasture makeup. So we need to think about our young animal, the clinical signs about getting cobalt into them to produce vitamin B12, which drives energy utilization. And without energy, we're not going to put that on. So here we're linking our mineral trace element side into animal nutrition, and that comes as a package as far as I'm concerned. But also coming back, that's on the lamb side, but also coming back to thinking that there may well be a more positive role of helping fertility, particularly at this time of year with your breeding flock. So cobalt is always seen generally as a young animal problem, but we can see areas here where cobalt may have roles to play in fertility function in older animals. And again, the type of cobalt and the function needs to be quite clear. So in terms of cobalt in the rumen, so we've already said storage, the body has little, if any, capacity to store it. So we're needing to continuously to supply that. So bear in mind, perhaps when the breeding ewes have been weaned, they'll be grazing pasture with a given cobalt level in it. So that's coming naturally. But what we might be thinking is that pre-tupping, we might need to lift that. So when we're thinking about putting these things in, it's all about pre-planning. It's not thinking that the ram's going to go out on November the 1st, and on November the 1st, I pop a bolus into the breeding stock and or the rams. I would have been thinking about that probably as much as 8 weeks previous to this. So we must think about the planning and getting things in time for these things to help work correctly. So obviously what we're looking for in this cobalt, particularly with our lambs, is really allowing the synthesis of vitamin B12 so that we can get the rumen microbes working, we can get digestion, we can get the best out of our forages, our crops that are our cheapest input that we're actually putting into the animals to grow. So trying to do everything off of grass is absolutely attainable, but we may need to think a little bit differently about our trace element mineral nutrition and how we go forward. So cobalt, out of the elements that I deal with, is probably the one that we spend most time trying to actually get right. So we need that, as I've already said, to synthesize vitamin B12. We need to make that rumen actually work effectively. And obviously we're looking at the synthesis of glucose to help thrive and fertility. So cobalt really is actually quite an essential element to get right. And I suppose what I'd be saying to you as an audience is that in terms of getting it right, what we need to think about is probably acting earlier to get cobalt in them, because once we see the signs of perhaps cobalt imbalances in animal, runny eyes, flaky ears, you've actually already lost the weight gain probably some 3 to 6 weeks prior to you seeing common areas. And obviously if you're putting animals across scales regularly, you may actually start to see that happening where they just stand still, even though they've got plenty of good stand in front of them to consume. So cobalt, very, very essential in the adult breeding flock, and essential obviously if you're running into problems with it in the young lambs. So we've had that already in terms of where we go. So just holding for a minute on cobalt, then the form of cobalt that is most applicable is a form of cobalt which is readily rumen available, so it can break down in the rumen to actually then produce the vitamin B12 and making that quite usable. So in some instances, some of the boluses on the market are a little bit too big, to say the least, for very small lambs. So there are other things that you can look at to actually put in place. Might be an injectable to start with, and then moving to a bolus if you're in real problems with getting cobalt into them. So there are plenty of things that we can look at. So cobalt essential in terms of when you see problems with it, act before you think you need to act. Coming into zinc as another trace element, then zinc itself is obviously slightly a non-storable element. You tend to be feeding a small layer by a pool, so it doesn't store well. But one of the things about zinc in getting it to work properly, and this goes across anybody's products, whether it's boluses, drenches, bag minerals, buckets, or whatever you might be doing, zinc actually needs to be in a ruminant 24/7, 365 to work effectively. So when we talk about trying to look at zinc and understanding what the power of zinc is, it's mainly wrapped up within looking at trying to bolster the immune system within the animal. And that's why it's of interest to flock masters, to our friends in the beef industry, our friends in the dairy industry, because of what it can actually bring in terms of defending the animal from an immunity situation, but also it actually has the ability, if done properly, to harden the outside layers of hoof and horn. So this is where you might start to get a little bit confused. It's not going to stop disease as such, but it may give the animal a better fighting chance of defending the rigors of soft feet, soft tissue. So that's one of the areas of zinc is quite an interest in terms of some of the products that are in the marketplace to try to get that zinc into animals. So when we talk about immunity, defending from disease and helping bolster the animal, reproduction it's quite involved in. In terms of another thing that we see quite often is broken mouth ewes, soft mouth ewes. We know that zinc can actually help improve the retention in the gums of teeth, etc. So there are areas here where we sometimes see broken mouth problems in ewes and zinc deficiency. So again, we think about that. Mastitis, again, it's not going to stop the animal, but it does give a better immune status system. And not so much in our UK market, but certainly facial eczema down in the New Zealand market, Australia, is very, very much used by zinc to try to defend the animal from that. And I think you'll find that one of the speakers later this morning will be talking about actually the possibility of supplying some trace elements from a more natural sourcing in woodland sourcing and leaf sourcing. And they may talk about zinc as an aside, but their major will be around cobalt. So that's talking about a natural area. So zinc itself, in terms of an element, trying to get it into an animal is very much something that you can think about and trying to build a picture of getting that zinc into them. So zinc deficiency symptoms that we might see are an unthrifty appearance, coat hair, stiff joints, dry scaly skin and on ears. Now, one or two of us have been thinking lately that we're sometimes not seeing the movement that we should see by supplying cobalt, and some of the cobalt interactions and signs are very similar to that of zinc deficiency. So we're hoping that we might be able to look a little bit more into the zinc cobalt relationship and understand a little bit more about what we're actually dealing with in terms of zinc or cobalt deficiency. So these are the types of things that even in 2020 we just still don't really understand. So really what I'm saying here is we need to try to be a little bit more understanding of the mineral imbalances or deficiencies we might see, which leads me to suggesting that we might be needing to use an investigating needle to take blood samples or liver samples. One or two vet colleagues around the United Kingdom are quite happily now doing live liver biopsies on adult sheep. So we've got the possibility of doing that without waiting for fallen stock, but we've also got a great possibility of looking at things like this in the lambs that you send to be killed, so that we can see and monitor things as we go on. So understanding what zinc's doing, understanding how important it is, and also understanding it again meets the list of those trace elements which are not stored. So it needs a daily trickle. So we've talked about some of the areas here where we see problems of zinc and immunity. So we're looking to try to get the animal here to actually get T cell working well, defending well, looking at cell membranes and the analogues to prevent antioxidant damage. So we're looking here for zinc to try to help cells, help them work effectively and actually try to increase that immune system function within the animal. So in the sheep industry, I think if I think about historically what people have done, there have been quite a lot of actions to get zinc into animals, which are right and correct. Now we're starting to understand a little bit more and see that type of zinc and how we get into the animal effectively. So zinc itself is very important, but again, needs to be in a form that the animal can get hold of effectively. So as we move forward into this, I've been chatting now, I think just close on 3/4 of an hour. So we come to the ever interesting element of copper. So copper in the sheep industry is talked about a lot, to whether we do or we don't use it, which breed can we use it on, which breed can't we use it on. So again, we need to think about copper and whether we're supplying insufficient copper to meet the animal's demand. So copper requirement for the animal is actually quite low, and that would run us into a deficiency, if you like, or an imbalance if we're not supplying enough. Excess iron and sulfur, excuse me, can be an issue, and also can prevent, to a point, the animal getting some of the copper. But we need to be very careful when we enter into these areas of other minerals doing damage within the rumen. So we have copper deficiency itself, which is our inability to get enough copper into them, but we also have excesses which we can see happening with the animals at the same time. So if you like, we'll just quickly look at copper deficiency. I've already said it, I think, as much as I can in terms of what we see within the animal. So insufficient copper being provided. So that is that copper deficiency area. What we're trying to do is get copper into the rumen, and then that copper will be absorbed. We can discuss how well copper is absorbed and how effectively it's stored or not stored and what it does, but that's something that's not within the depth of today's conversation. And then obviously we see iron and sulfur. It will tend to look at binding in the rumen and preventing some of the absorption of copper through into the animal. So it's really there and not being used that well. So we need to think about how well that works. But obviously molybdenum is involved in this area as well, and we need to think about how we can understand that a little bit better. So just have a quick look at why do ruminants need copper. Really, copper itself is quite a small element in a way. It's just being supplied in various sources, but it is really the power of copper and what it does within the animal is quite tremendous. So for argument's sake, it has a connection with phosphorus. It is actually one of the trace elements which helps phosphorus actually utilize in the body and transfer through the body. So it has a straight connection to a macro mineral. It has a role in the production of enzymes, white blood cell function. It helps swayback prevention in lambs. So for those of you who still sadly see it, it's possibly going to be a copper issue around there. Healthy wool and hair. So it's also tied up with those areas, but it's also tied up with poor wool quality, fertility, anemia, can cause diarrhea. So there's all sorts of things that copper is actually involved in within the animal. But probably when we're talking about this, swayback in the young animal would probably be one of the most easiest decisions or descriptors to look at. So what we see is copper not being provided properly through the gestation period, and it stops the animal actually developing its nervous systems, its spinal cords properly, and then we get this hind limb, wobbly legs affected in the animal. So we need to think how we supply copper correctly and properly. I would argue very much that I think copper should be probably definitely supported by bloods and blood testing and understanding the whole sphere of what's going on. So we need to make sure that we're doing that correctly. So there are many things in terms of copper that we need to get right, and many things that we need to check through to do that. And I underline the importance of using diagnostics to make sure that we're putting the right amounts in at the right times. So we've talked about the production of enzymes and where these things are to do with fertility, to do with thrive, to do with immunity. So we're looking at copper in the right levels. It doesn't need to be a lot to support these elements, but again, understanding when we need to use it, whether it's correct to use it, and making sure that through the calendar that we're not putting too much in at any one time. So in terms of fertility, in terms of thrive, in terms of immunity, it has important functions. But when we talk sheep in particular, Bimeda would be very clear on this, in terms of what we know and we need to think about. We need to make sure that in supplementation process, we need to make sure that the copper is needed, as I've said, by looking at the symptoms, signs that one would see on farm, looking at blood levels, and then looking at liver levels as well as we go forward. The other area that some people sometimes forget, and I've hinted at this before, is that we might pop a bolus into a flock which is going in to be housed. So we have a bolus going in covering, shall we say, the 5 months odd of gestation. Bolus is going to last for 6 months or so. Then they come in, we start putting some hard feed in front of them, and obviously most of those feeds don't generally have copper in unless you're doing it for other reasons. And we want to make sure that we, not building too much copper into them. And particularly when we come inside, because some of the antagonists to copper have been taken away, like molybdenum, sulfur and iron have been taken away, or shall I say depressed, because they're not grazing, then that can put us into a road of too much copper in one place at one time, and unfortunately lead to copper toxicity. So again, we need to get our balance and understanding and our planning right for when we're talking about copper and copper inputs into animals. So if we see copper toxicity, there are breeds especially, and I'm one of the people that tend to run away from Texels and other breeds that are such like that may have automatic problems with too much copper in them. So we know that there are breeds that are at risk. I know that some breeders do automatically use copper, but this needs some thinking about, and certainly needs to be backed up with veterinary advice and again bloods, etc. That is not a recommendation to use it in any of these breeds, but I know it can happen. But what we actually see with copper, it starts to get into the animal, it starts to build up within the liver, and what we then see is an explosion of copper out of the liver, and actually gives us major problems with stripping oxygen out of the blood, and this will cause death within the animal. My own feeling is that we only see the top of an iceberg in terms of copper toxicity in animals. I believe it to be a bigger problem than perhaps we understand. So making sure that when we supply trace elements, we supply them correctly and at the right time. We do not want to see the type of photographs we have here. So on the left, on the right screen, this is actually one of Fiona Lovett's slides that I've pinched. But in terms of the liver here, the liver is dead and dying, and the absolute confirmation is the kidney on the right hand side, which is now black, gunmetal black, which we know that is not working well. So we've had a quick look through trace elements this morning, and we've had a little bit of information about what they are and what they're doing. So those are the types of things that can be thought about and how we do them, etc., etc. So I'm going to spend a few minutes now on bolusing and other methods of supplementation. So if we look at trace element boluses, generally the advantage of these boluses, they are targeted because most of the elements within them are required, but that means that we've understood their requirements, so we can get those in. There is a period of long-lasting slow release on them. They're easy to administer with practice, so that means that when we think about putting boluses in, we need to prepare properly, and we need to have the right equipment and the right bolus guns, and they're delivering a given amount of trace element over a period of time. But again, at farm level, we think about the advantages and disadvantages. Sometimes it's perceived as difficult to administer for bolusing generally, which I agree with, but practice tries to make perfect. But in terms of making sure that you've got the animals in a controlled area, that you're putting them through a pratley or a race, or whichever way you find easy to do it, but think about how you can make the job easier. But administration cannot be rushed, because in many ways you're actually making a treatment. You're putting a bolus in to deliver products. So it's a bit like putting injections into animals. It just needs to be done quietly, effectively, and calmly. So trace element boluses have a place across animal mineral nutrition. They're not the be all and end all. So you also need to think about trace elements on one side, and then you think about macro elements on another. So we have to think about packaging and what animals actually require. So in terms of the Bimeda bolus, having a look at that in just an area, the bolus is a glass bolus, and one of the major features and benefits, if you like, about the glass bolus is that the glass bolus itself is supplying a form of copper which is actually available in the rumen. So that will A, give enough copper to give the animal its requirement a day, but it's also very effective form of copper at blocking the ill effects of molybdenum and sulfur within the rumen. And as far as I am aware, it's the only product within the marketplace that has that dual polarity to do the two things. So this form of copper is referred to as ionic. It's very available. It is not a copper oxide product. So there are some differences between the boluses in the terms of the form of copper that you have in a bolus and its mode of action. So if you look at the glass bolus in the dairy world for Cozy Cure cattle, it's a PON VPS. So the sheep products are not, but some of the work around copper would be very similar when we talk about sheep as well. So you have a difference in type of bolus and how it's made. The glass bolus is not a sphere holding elements inside it. It is a total hard piece of dissolving phosphate glass which has copper in its makeup. So it's an interesting product to deal with. The Cozy Cure sheep range as well also has a great benefit of delivering cobalt into the rumen. Reply again on this, start again. It's a bolus which is supplying cobalt into the rumen, which is highly available straight away and has been proven by trial work to probably be the most effective bolus where cobalt supplementation is required, because it becomes immediately available in the animal and actually feeds the animal's need to produce vitamin B12. So again, it's different forms and different understandings about how things actually work within animals. So one needs to think about that. So in terms of the supplementation, so here on the screen at the moment, you have a Bimeda bolus system. On the left-hand side of the screen is the bolus unpacked and the bolus actually then dissolving over a given period. And actually, it sort of suggests here that the bolus doesn't actually dissolve in totality. It does. It goes away to absolutely nothing. So what happens here is the bolus goes into the rumen, and very, very crudely, the liquor in the rumen has a given pH, and that lets the bolus dissolve and give off its trace elements on a daily basis. It doesn't need grinders. It doesn't need to act against anything else. It is a natural reoccurring pH dissolution in the rumen. So in the field, we have lots of different ways of looking at doing supplementation for animals. So we've got total mixed rations, concentrate, bagged minerals. Again, all these things are effective and work, but we need to think about how these things are not going to be oversupplied and are going to be put together properly for animals and not wasting money on farm, but are actually targeted and working within a program. So in terms of those areas, we need to think how we best do that and understand the best way forward and the best products. And then we look at some areas where we can design products which actually are very generic to the farm, but that's outside of the scope of this morning. But also we've got the other trace element areas to think about in terms of putting trace elements into animals. Buckets, for argument's sake, very easy for you to get hold of and provide. They are a very good way of getting them in there, low labor. But sometimes, obviously, some of the problems and issues that we see around buckets is making sure that we get in what we want to get in, and actually we don't want to see too much transfer of other issues with badgers, etc. But I accept that there are ways to keep buckets and blocks out of badgers' ways, which companies have done quite a lot of work on in time. So understand what you're trying to do, understand whether the product is actually right for what you're trying to overcome with. But if you're using mixtures of these things, make sure that you don't overdo them. And when I say mixtures, I mean mixed products. So in terms of trace element drenches, They're very good, cost effective, relatively easy to administer, and generally, you know, there's a broad range of elements within them. So we need to think what they are. But in terms of cobalt itself, I accept obviously that you can buy very inexpensive cobalt sulfate liquid drenches, which you can make up. But if you're buying a general drench, you know, sometimes we're actually buying stuff that we don't need, but we need to make sure what's suitable and what works for you. But the key about cobalt with any drench is that you're going to probably have to do them every 2-week period. So you've then got the handling, bringing them in, etc., etc. So has the bolus got the advantage in that situation? So those are the sorts of questions you start to look at when we're doing these sort of things and thoughts. So in terms of cobalt versus drench, what you're trying basically to have a look at is the supply of cobalt in the rumen being an absolute level and trying to just go through the peaks and troughs, whereas the drench is going to come up and down, and that's just factual. It's not going to work. It's just which way that you detect that you wish to do this. So it's making sure that you can get a bolus in which is going to give a level feed of cobalt right the way through, particularly in the young animal, and a drench which is going to need ups and downs in its supplementation to get the level right, which say is about every 2 to 3 weeks. So in terms of looking at that, there's loads and loads of products out there, and I cannot cover all that this morning. That's a week's work, to say the least. So in terms of where we are, thinking what you need, but I think just to summarize on that for the moment, think about your animals, think about stock, make sure you're dealing with mineral issues by looking at bloods, looking at forest mineral analysis, and seeing how you best target the understanding of those, and then choosing what we think is the best product and taking advice using bloods and liver and involving your veterinary surgeon as much as you can. So in terms of those areas, we then want to look a little bit about bolusing itself. So in terms of the bolus itself and the Bimeda bolus, there are a couple of things that you really need to be aware of. And it's really about thinking about the planning. So we're going to bolus, we think about need to define the need, product choice, timing of application. So defining need obviously is understanding the trace element imbalances you have. Product choice in the Cozy Cure range or other ranges is down to what you define need for. Timing of application is actually really important. So in terms of pre-tupping, 6 to probably 8 weeks out, I'd like to see that going in. Some people will do it later. Just depends what you're trying to do. And then if you're looking at lambs, you're not going to be putting boluses in lambs until certain weights, and you're definitely not going to be putting ruminal boluses in lambs until you know they're ruminating and that they have the spatial capacity to take the bolus, and that's quite key. So preparation, and this is key, ladies and gentlemen, absolutely key with the Cozy Cure product range. This morning it's raining cats and dogs here. Temperature wise not too bad, but the temperature of the glass bolus is actually quite important to get right. So you need those at sort of room temperature, hand temperature. So it means taking the product out of the cardboard boxes, taking the product out of the silver pouches, and then putting the products into your overalls or keeping them somewhere just on the warmer side. Difficult in farm situation, I know, but read the instructions and make sure that that is right. So if you put a cold bolus into a warm rumen, because it is glass, it can get little fissures in it, and then that doesn't help the bolus staying down. So the preparation of the product is absolutely key. You're spending a lot of money on it. Try and do the best you can. So think about how to do that. Try and bolus stock on an empty stomach. So bring them in, let them stand and bolus. Once bolused, or thinking about the preparation of the area, put straw down around the areas if you're working off concrete, just in case if the bolus does fall out the applicator, or it falls out of the animal's mouth. If it goes onto concrete, it's liable to smash. Do not put the bolus back in the gun if it's smashed in pieces. Discard it. put a new bolus in, and always use an applicator that is recommended by Bimeda. So in terms of thinking about those, it does take a bit of thinking about, handle it with care. So the performance, we need to take time to put the product into the animal. Just because anybody's bolus gun may have an applicator area of it, but the stem of the applicator might be 6, 8 inches, 9 inches, 10 inches, a foot long. That doesn't all need to go in the animal. It's just a matter of putting the bolus gun over the back of the throat, because what you're trying to do is actually get the animal to swallow it down. You're trying to work with the animal's own gag reflex. So it's just across the back of the throat, holding the hand nice and steady around the animal, retaining and making sure that the bolus is actually staying within the animal. And if not, then it spits it back out, pop it back in again, and we go from there. Let them stand on yards before you let them back out into fields, so you can just see that the bolusing function has been correct, watching the bolus swallow as you apply it, and then making sure they don't chuck them up fairly quickly because it hasn't been swallowed correctly. And then if you can limit any handling, particularly putting them on their backs, etc., after, that's a good thing to try to do. So think about planning, preparation, and performance. There's a bit that goes after that, but I don't know my audience, so you can make your own minds up what I'd like to say. So in terms of where we are, think about those things, and that should help you along your way. So in terms of thinking about that, we'll just have a quick look at the Bimeda range. So the overview of the product range itself is a product range which is Cozy Cure, and the Cozy Cure range, the blue ones, all have a copper base in them. For those that you're interested, Zinco Icel is back. It's come back in a different form, and Bimeda have that color differential. So everything that's blue in their range has got a copper content to it. Everything that's purple in their range at this point does not have a copper content. It is a non-copper bolus, being Zinc Icel. So when we look at the Bimeda range, you have the boluses containing copper, the adult ones. If you start to look at those type of things that you want, it does have this ionic cobalt, it has the ionic copper that we spoke about, and obviously is delivering in another form as Cozy iCure iodine. They do differ slightly. So the Cozy Cure adult sheet, the old original product, iodine, selenium, and copper. Then if you look at the Cozy iCure, it gives you a selenium, but it gives you slightly less selenium as your Cozy Cure. Have a look at the data sheets, have a look at the weights, and obviously, as it says in red here, check the data sheets, take the time to read them, look specifically at weights, and my advice is do not use copper on sensitive breeds. So have a think about what those products are giving you there. We then come into the Cozy Cure lamb range. Again, the blue ones containing copper. Again, make sure you need these, talk about correct advice on using, and then make sure that when you're looking at using any product in the lambs, as I've already said, make sure they're fully ruminating, make sure the lamb has the spatial awareness to take any product, and make sure you're using the right product. Again, data sheets, look at the information, make sure that you're not using it on copper sensitive breeds. Moving into the other areas, so the relaunch of Zinc Icel, bringing zinc into the fold again for the sheep market is something that the producers have been asking for. So thinking about that zinc, particularly where you can't use copper for getting the other trace elements in, and then looking at the role of zinc itself, but remembering that selenium is involved in this and getting that in as well. The cobalt's still there, and all the technical issues around the sourcing are the same as Cozy Cure. So it's good ionic forms of cobalt, good ionic forms of iodine and zinc to get them into the animal, get them utilized and work correctly. So in summary, and that's me coming very much to the end, Helen, trace elements should be supplied only when they know to be beneficial and animals are deficient. Blood testing, as I said, in conjunction with forage analysis, liver analysis to determine standards, and also obtaining liver samples is gold standard. so that we start to build a picture and then supplementing these animals correctly, making sure that trace element deficiencies can actually be rectified, and then giving you a financial boost for it, and then making sure that the investment you've made really is going to help those animals be more profitable to you, but always administer those boluses carefully and properly, and look at all the data sheets that go along with it. So the Bimeda range can be seen and viewed on Cozy Cure Boluses UK, I think it's called, and the information there that can be given. And I'm sure that any of the Bimeda people will be more than happy to chat to you about these products. So there we are, Helen.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was a very interesting talk, and yeah, it's put my mind at rest with a few issues that I think I've got myself. We've got 8 questions at the moment in the Q&A. Would you like me to read those out?
Please, yeah, read those out.
I'll let you just have a drink first. I don't blame you after talking for an hour. That's very impressive. Okay, I'll start at the top. Are the mineral drenches adequate for lambs? I do this monthly as cobalt problem identified.
Yeah, so drenches with a cobalt, I would actually say if it was cobalt straight, I'd bring it actually down to every probably 2 weeks to 3 weeks, but it sounds as though this might be a multiple drench. So whilst it will do the job for cobalt and it may help with others, I just question whether you might actually be overdoing it with some other trace elements. Okay,
thank you. The next one is asking about sort of more research. Peter has highlighted the historic nature of much of the data on mineral nutrition, one that has concerned me for some time. Does he see a strong case for pushing to get research in this area to give some good quantitative data for our modern breeds and production systems? And I presume that's a simple yes. And to support a push for this, perhaps through the up-and-coming pathway programme, can he begin to put a cost on mineral/vitamin deficiencies on a national scale to help make the cash for relevant research? That's from Jan, one of our NSA representatives.
Jan, the answer to the question is that there are other people on this webinar that I know that would love to do what you're saying, and I'd be one of them, very much. So there have been discussions about what we can do to do this. So I think it's possible for us to try to give some of the information into either NSA or other bodies, but I think the area would be trying to identify a hit list of probably 6 areas that we think that producers really need quality information. So I think not a broad brush approach, but a very planned, distinct argument to put that together. I'd love to be part of it. 1 or 2 people on this webinar would know that.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a good plan to me, sort of thing. And it's almost similar to us trying to deal with the iceberg diseases, just having a named few and been targeted and going forward. I was really surprised when you said there had not been any research sort of on this since the 80s. So I think it's become more of a hot topic at the moment in the last 2 or 3 years, where you've sort of highlighted about cobalt and zinc and different things. So yeah, I would say it is something that we do need to look at, and I value Jan's comment there and question.
Yeah, no, very good question, very well put, and probably quite poorly answered, but the answer is
not at all. We have another one. Is copper sulfate or also not rumen available?
Copper sulfate is to a partial point rumen available, but also your problem with copper sulfate is that if you take if you take copper sulfate, it's 25% copper, and the majority of the rest of it is sulfate. So why some of us don't always like using it is we worry about adding more sulfate into the rumen molybdenum issue. So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it as a product, but it's just trying to understand what you're doing. So whether you're trying to fight a pure copper deficiency, or whether you're trying to fight problems around copper to do with molybdenum and sulfur, and in that case, I probably would not use copper sulfate.
Okay, thank you. More a comment really. Recent research has shown need to administer cobalt drenches weekly to be as efficient as a bolus, in brackets, not Bimeda bolus.
Yeah, so there is some data around those areas. So there's some work going on in Ireland. So if you look at the way that the Drenches, and that's a very wide comment I just made about Drenches, but that would be basically what I was trying to say, is that you may need to be even less than 2 weeks. You might need to be weekly to get the power of the cobalt to do the job. So while we're on this area, then the other question that might come from this is there are various products in this country which are imported, and one of those is Smart Shot. And again, we've tried to look at that as well as a cobalt supplementation, but that's an injectable. So there are other areas around that.
Yeah. Marie Preble has asked, how long do you suggest emptying sheep out before bolusing? How long does it take to empty the rumen?
Okay, so if it's possible, I try to completely empty it would take quite a while, to say the least. But basically what I try to do is let them stand 3 to 4 hours before I bolus. Some people will stand them overnight, but I feel that's just a little bit of a long time. But that's where I go, is to try basically to just, put an edge on their appetite is a way I approach that practically, Helen.
Yeah, okay, that sounds good. How long does the zinc bolus last? The copper one states 6 to 8 months. Is the zinc one the same?
No, it's not. It's claimed it 4 months on the data sheets.
Okay, that's fine. In their analysis of forages, have Bimeda got any information on the ability of different forages to take up minerals related to root depth, i.e. is better mineral content of herbal lays, apocrine or actual apocrinal?
Right, okay. Interesting question, and it comes back to...
This came from Jan.
Oh, right, okay. It came from Jan, right. So it comes back to what Jan's answer was asking. So some of the way of answering this is that if we go backwards in history, it looks as though from a lot of the information I can find off of the Cotswolds where I live, is that the old flock masters would have used the legumes, the vetches, the plantains to some degree. And it seems as though they went away from those because they felt production was not as good as it could be. So the more modern grass varieties came in. So we know that because of the way that we grow, or had been growing some of the more modern high producing grasses, the mineral content of some of those would have been depressed. So off the back of non-scientific information and some of the work that has been done in Aber, we would feel that the broader approach, if you like, the plantains, the chicories, all those types of grazing platforms possibly are a better accumulator of trace elements. What we need to make sure is that there are positive trace elements and there are negative trace elements. So we want to make sure that comment is not there. So there is a little bit of work going on in Devon at the moment. Nigel Kendall speaking after me this morning with the Woodland Trust, I think, and that Nigel might allude to things around actually willow and cobalt. So that's one side of it, being more woodland argument. But I would say my experience is, coming back to Jan, is forage mineral analysis is the way to understand what those grazing platforms are giving us. So I gave a cost of 50 quid. Actually, that is quite high. It will be less than that, but I'm just covering my backside, frankly. So if you're unsure and producers are unsure, there is a very, very, in my view, effective way of trying to get that information farm to farm.
Yeah, and I would say, well, I live in Wales, and I think Farming Connect do offer some various things as well. So there are opportunities for people to follow things up on that, I think.
Yeah, so
The rest of some of this is just comments. Support from organisations such as NSA would be very important for determining research needs, and an independent assessment of supplements to determine they actually do what they claim. Jan's commented that we need to follow that up. There has been some research, but nowhere near as much as the 80s. And then it said cobalt sulfate, not copper. Might have been me misreading something, but I think you knew what I meant later in the question.
right.
And one last question here: is there any evidence to suggest that buckets of mineral supplements can cause scours in some sheep? Is it more likely that it's the molasses, stroke binders, etc., that could cause this?
Sorry, could you just repeat that question, Helen? Sorry.
Sorry, Peter. Is there any evidence to suggest that buckets of mineral supplements can cause scours in some sheep? Is it more likely that it's the molasses, binders, etc., that could cause this?
It's possible for molasses to scour animals. It's possible.
Okay.
You need to make up, basically, if that is an issue, I would go directly back to the supplier and speak to them about that. But mineral supplements that will make animals scour, sulfur has the capacity to do it. Too much molybdenum in the field process, so i.e. the grazing platform, will scour animals. So I think probably a little bit of investigation outside the product before you go looking too much at the product.
Okay, that seems to have brought a close to the question and answers. So I'd like to thank Peter for his time, and Bimeda for sponsoring this webinar again this morning. And I hope you anybody that's going to listen to the rest of today does so. And just to say, NSA, we do appreciate you taking part, and look forward to meeting up with you soon. Stay safe.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Helen. Bye-bye.
No problem. Thank you.